The bottle of whiskey sat on the wooden table like a death sentence. 14-year-old Clementine Ross watched her uncle Rufus Callahan's trembling hands reach for it, knowing that in exchange, she was about to become someone else's property. The Red Dog Saloon reeked of tobacco, sweat, and broken dreams. Clementine stood in the corner, her worn dress hanging loose on her thin frame, trying to make herself invisible as men's eyes crawled over her like hungry vultures. She'd seen this moment coming for weeks, ever since Rufus lost his last dollar at the poker table and started eyeing her like she was livestock. Sitting across from Rufus was a man who looked like he'd crawled out of the desert. His clothes were dusty, his hat battered, and his boots worn down to almost nothing. Gideon Marsh appeared to be just another drifter passing through Copper Ridge, Arizona territory. But something about his eyes didn't match the rest of him. They were too sharp, too calculating for a man who supposedly had nothing. Rufus's voice cracked as he spoke. "She's a good worker. Real quiet. Won't give you no trouble." His words slurred from the drink he'd already consumed. "All I need is that bottle there, and she's yours." Clementine's stomach twisted into knots. She wanted to run, to scream, to fight, but where could a 14-year-old girl go in the middle of the Arizona desert? Her parents died of fever 2 years ago, leaving her with Rufus, her father's brother who saw her as nothing more than a burden to feed and now apparently a commodity to trade. Gideon studied the girl for a long moment. Behind his weathered exterior, his mind was racing. He'd come to Copper Ridge in disguise to see how his mining investments were affecting the local communities. What he'd found was worse than he'd imagined. Desperation so deep that men were willing to sell children for alcohol. The other men in the saloon watched with sick fascination. Some laughed, others shook their heads, but none stepped forward to stop what was happening. This was the kind of place where decent folks didn't venture after dark, and those who did had long since abandoned their consciences. Gideon reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. The clink of coins made Rufus's eyes light up with greedy hope. "That bottle, plus 2 silver dollars," Gideon said quietly. Rufus nearly fell out of his chair reaching for the money. "Deal. She's all yours, mister." Clementine felt the world spinning around her. In the span of 30 seconds, her life had been reduced to the value of cheap whiskey and 2 pieces of silver. She looked at this stranger who now owned her, searching his face for any hint of what nightmare awaited her. But what Gideon planned to do with his new purchase would shock everyone in that saloon, including Clementine herself. Gideon stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. The sound cut through the saloon's chatter like a knife, and suddenly every conversation died. All eyes were on him, and the terrified girl who now belonged to him. "Come on then," he said to Clementine, his voice surprisingly gentle. But she heard it as a command from her new master and felt her legs go weak. As they walked toward the door, Clementine caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Poor little thing. Probably end up in a brothel. That's what happens to girls with no family." Each word was a dagger to her heart, confirming her worst fears about what this stranger planned to do with her. The desert air hit them as they stepped outside. Copper Ridge's main street was nearly empty except for a few drunks stumbling between establishments. Gideon walked beside her, not behind her like she expected. He wasn't grabbing her arm or treating her like escaped livestock. The confusion only added to her terror. "Where are we going?" Clementine finally found the courage to whisper. "Somewhere we can talk without those vultures listening," Gideon replied, nodding back toward the saloon. They stopped beside a water trough near the general store. Gideon turned to face her, and in the moonlight Clementine could see something in his expression that didn't match what she expected from a man who'd just bought a human being. There was anger there, but it didn't seem directed at her. "What's your name, child?" "Clementine Ross," she answered, her voice barely audible. "And that man in there, Rufus, he's family." She nodded. "My uncle. Been taking care of me since my parents died." The word care felt like a lie even as she said it. Gideon was quiet for a moment, studying her face. Behind his calm exterior, rage was building, not at this frightened girl, but at a system that allowed children to be traded like cattle. He'd seen poverty in his mining towns, but this level of desperation was something else entirely. "Clementine, I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you," he said, crouching down so they were eye level. "You're not my property. You're not anyone's property. Do you understand that?" She stared at him, certain she'd heard wrong. Men didn't spend money just to set people free. Not in her experience. But you paid for me, she whispered, confused. I paid to get you away from that situation. There's a difference. Clementine's mind raced. Nothing about this made sense. Men like Gideon, rough working men, they didn't rescue girls out of kindness. There had to be a catch. Some twisted plan he wasn't revealing yet. What do you want from me then? She asked, taking a step backward. Before Gideon could answer, the saloon doors burst open behind them. Rufus came stumbling out, the empty whiskey bottle in his hand, and fury in his bloodshot eyes. He'd apparently had second thoughts about their deal. Hey, where do you think you're taking my niece? Rufus Callahan staggered toward them, the empty bottle swinging dangerously in his grip. The whiskey had done nothing to numb the realization that he'd just traded away his only remaining source of income, Clementine's labor around their ramshackle cabin. You can't just walk off with her like that, Rufus slurred, pointing an accusing finger at Gideon. We didn't discuss terms proper. She's worth more than a bottle and 2 coins. Gideon slowly rose to his full height, and something about his posture made Rufus stop mid-stride. The seemingly harmless drifter had transformed into something more threatening, like a sleeping wolf suddenly awakened. The deal's done, Callahan. You got what you asked for. But I changed my mind, Rufus whined. She's blood family. I got rights. Clementine felt sick watching her uncle's performance. For 2 years, he'd made it clear she was nothing but a burden. Someone to cook his meals, mend his clothes, and absorb his drunken rage when the whiskey turned him mean. Now suddenly she was valuable to him. Rights? Gideon's voice carried a dangerous edge. What kind of man sells his own blood for liquor? Other men began filtering out of the saloon, drawn by the commotion. Word was spreading fast that something interesting was happening on Main Street. In a town like Copper Ridge, entertainment was scarce and a dispute over a sold girl was better than most Saturday night attractions. She ain't really sold, one of the onlookers called out. Rufus is just having seller's remorse. Maybe they should arm wrestle for her, another suggested, earning ugly laughter from the growing crowd. Clementine wanted to disappear into the ground. These men were discussing her fate like she was a piece of livestock, and the worst part was that legally, that's exactly what she was. Women and children had few rights in the territory, and orphaned girls like her had even fewer. Rufus, emboldened by the crowd's support, stepped closer. Look, mister, I don't know who you think you are, but that girl's been my responsibility for 2 years. I fed her, clothed her, kept a roof over her head. That's worth more than what you paid. The lie was so blatant that Clementine gasped. She'd been the one scavenging for food, mending her own threadbare clothes and patching the holes in their cabin roof. Rufus had spent every penny he could find on gambling and drink. Gideon glanced at Clementine and saw the truth written all over her face. The girl's condition told the real story. She was undernourished, her dress was practically falling apart, and there were old bruises on her arms that spoke of regular mistreatment. How much? Gideon asked quietly. The crowd pressed closer. Rufus's eyes lit up with greed. $20. Cash. It was an enormous sum. More money than most people in Copper Ridge saw in 6 months. Rufus clearly expected Gideon to walk away, leaving Clementine behind. But what happened next would leave the entire town talking for years to come. Without hesitation, Gideon reached into his coat and pulled out a roll of bills that made the crowd gasp. In the flickering light of the street lamps, they could see more money than most of them had ever witnessed in one place. He counted out $20 and held it toward Rufus. Done. The silence that followed was deafening. Rufus stared at the money like it might disappear if he blinked. $20 was enough to keep him drunk for months, maybe even buy into some of the higher-stakes poker games in the neighboring towns. But something about how easily Gideon had produced such a sum made the crowd uneasy. Working men, drifters, miners, ranch hands. They didn't carry rolls of cash like that. They counted pennies and made dollars stretch for weeks. "Who the hell are you, mister?" asked Tom Bradley, the saloon owner who'd followed the crowd outside. Gideon ignored the question and kept his attention on Rufus. "Take the money and walk away. This is the last time we discuss this." Rufus snatched the bills so fast he nearly dropped the empty bottle. "Pleasure doing business," he mumbled, stuffing the money into his pocket. As he turned to go back into the saloon, he paused and looked at Clementine with something that might have been regret, or maybe just the calculation of a man wondering if he'd sold too cheap. The crowd began to disperse, but their whispered conversations carried on the night air. "That ain't no ordinary drifter. You see how much money he had? Something ain't right about this whole thing. Clementine stood frozen, watching her uncle disappear back into the saloon. Despite everything he'd put her through, he was the only family she had left. Now, she was truly alone in the world with a complete stranger who carried mysterious amounts of cash. Clementine, Gideon said gently, I know you're scared, but I need you to trust me for just a little while longer. Trust. The word felt foreign to her. When had anyone ever proven worthy of her trust? Where are we going? She asked. Somewhere safe. Somewhere you can eat a proper meal and sleep in a real bed. If you were Clementine, what would you do? Follow this mysterious stranger who just spent a fortune to buy your freedom? Or run into the desert night and take your chances alone? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose. Because what Clementine decided next would change everything she thought she knew about survival. She looked back at the saloon, then at the dark desert stretching endlessly beyond the town. Finally, she looked at Gideon, really looked at him. Despite his rough appearance, there was something in his eyes that Rufus had never shown her, genuine concern for her welfare. Okay, she whispered. They walked together through the quiet streets of Copper Ridge toward the town's only decent hotel. As they approached the Grand Palace Hotel, which was neither grand nor palatial, just the cleanest establishment in town, Gideon paused. Clementine, I need to tell you something. My real name isn't what I told your uncle. She looked up at him, confused and frightened again. And tomorrow, when the sun comes up, this whole town is going to discover exactly who I really am. The hotel clerk's eyes widened when Gideon approached the front desk. Harold Weston had been working at the Grand Palace for 15 years, and he'd never seen someone dressed like a common drifter request their finest room while pulling out a roll of cash, thick enough to choke a horse. I need your best accommodations for the night, Gideon said, placing a $20 bill on the counter. And have the kitchen prepare a hot meal, something suitable for a young lady. Harold's gaze shifted nervously between Gideon and Clementine. Word traveled fast in small towns, and he'd already heard whispers about the unusual transaction at the Red Dog Saloon. The last thing he wanted was trouble in his establishment. Sir, I'm not sure we can accommodate unusual arrangements, Harold stammered. Gideon's expression hardened. The girl needs food and a safe place to sleep. Are you telling me this hotel doesn't provide those basic services? No, sir, of course we do. It's just that... Harold glanced around nervously, then leaned forward and whispered, People are talking, sir, about what happened at the saloon. Maybe it would be better if you found lodging elsewhere. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Harold assumed the worst about Gideon's intentions with Clementine, and his moral cowardice was wrapped in the thin disguise of business concerns. Clementine felt her cheeks burn with shame. Even here, in what was supposed to be the town's most respectable establishment, she was being treated like damaged goods. I see, Gideon said quietly. He reached into his coat again and pulled out a small leather wallet. From it, he withdrew a card and placed it on the counter next to the money. Harold picked up the card and his face went pale. His hand started shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. Mr. Marsh, he whispered, I had no idea. Please forgive me, sir. Clementine watched the transformation with fascination. Whatever was written on that card had turned the arrogant hotel clerk into a groveling servant in the span of seconds. Your finest suite, Gideon repeated, his voice carrying new authority. Hot food, hot bath water, and absolute discretion. Yes, sir. Immediately, sir. Right away. Harold frantically rang the bell for assistance. Jenny, get up here now. A young woman appeared from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. When Harold whispered urgent instructions in her ear, her eyes went wide, too. This way, please, Jenny said, grabbing a set of keys from behind the counter. Suite 7, our finest accommodations. As they climbed the stairs, Clementine couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. What did that card say? Gideon paused on the landing. Something that's going to complicate our situation considerably. But before he could explain, footsteps thundered up the hotel stairs behind them. Sheriff Marcus Kane burst onto the landing, his hand resting on his gun. Hold it right there, he commanded. I'm placing you under arrest for human trafficking. Sheriff Kane's weathered face was set in grim determination as he faced Gideon on the hotel stairs. At 52, Marcus Kane had seen enough ugliness in his 20 years of law enforcement to recognize trouble when it walked into his town. A mysterious stranger buying a 14-year-old girl definitely qualified as trouble. "Sheriff," Gideon said calmly, raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't reaching for a weapon. "There's been a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding is you thinking you could traffic a child through my territory without consequences," Kane replied, his hand still hovering over his Colt. "Clementine, step away from him. You're safe now." Clementine found herself caught between two men, neither of whom she fully understood. The sheriff represented law and order, but returning to Rufus meant returning to a life of misery and abuse. Gideon had shown her kindness, but everyone seemed to believe he had sinister motives. "Sheriff Kane," Harold Weston called up from the bottom of the stairs, his voice cracking with nervousness. "Sir, you might want to see this before you make any arrests." He held up the card Gideon had shown him. Kane kept his eyes on Gideon but gestured for Harold to bring the card up. When the hotel clerk placed it in his hand, the sheriff's confident expression faltered. He read it once, then again, then looked at Gideon with new confusion. "This can't be right," Kane muttered. "I assure you it is," Gideon replied. Clementine watched the exchange with growing frustration. Everyone seemed to know something she didn't, and she was tired of being treated like a piece of furniture while adults decided her fate. "What does it say?" she demanded. Sheriff Kane looked at her, then at Gideon, clearly struggling with how to proceed. The card in his hand had completely changed the situation, but it didn't resolve the moral questions surrounding a grown man purchasing a child. "Miss Ross," Kane said carefully, "this man claims to be Gideon Marsh. Not just any Gideon Marsh, but the owner of the Copper Ridge Mining Company, and half the silver mines in the territory." The words hit Clementine like a physical blow. The Copper Ridge Mining Company was legendary throughout the Arizona territory, one of the most successful mining operations in the Southwest. Its owner was rumored to be worth more money than some small countries. "That's impossible," she whispered, looking at Gideon's worn clothes and dusty boots. "You look like a drifter," Gideon finished. "That was intentional. I've been traveling through my mining towns in disguise to see how business is really conducted when people don't know who I am." Sheriff Kane lowered his weapon but didn't holster it. "Even if you are who you claim to be, it doesn't change the fact that you purchased a human being. That's illegal, regardless of your intentions." "Is it illegal to pay someone's debts to get them away from an abusive situation?" Gideon asked. "Depends on what you plan to do with the girl afterward." The tension on the staircase was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other hotel guests had begun peering out of their rooms, drawn by the commotion. Jenny stood pressed against the wall, clearly wishing she was anywhere else. Gideon reached slowly into his coat pocket, making sure his movements were visible to the sheriff. He pulled out an official-looking document and handed it to Kane. "What's this?" the sheriff asked, unfolding the paper. "Legal guardianship papers," Gideon replied. "Already signed and witnessed in Phoenix. I've been planning to establish an orphanage here in Copper Ridge for months. Clementine will be my first ward." But as Sheriff Kane read the document, his expression grew even more troubled than before. Sheriff Kane's brow furrowed deeper as he studied the guardianship document. The papers looked official enough. Proper seals, legal language, signatures from Phoenix territorial authorities. But something about the timing bothered him. "These papers are dated 3 days ago," Kane said slowly. "But you just met Clementine tonight at the saloon. How do you have guardianship papers for a girl you never met?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Even Harold and Jenny leaned closer, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary unfold. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, and Clementine could see him weighing his words carefully. Whatever he was about to reveal would change everything, again. "Because I've been watching this town for weeks, Sheriff, and I've been watching Rufus Callahan's treatment of his niece." The admission sent a chill through everyone present. Clementine felt her stomach drop. Had this entire evening been orchestrated? Had her rescue been planned all along? "You've been spying on us?" Kane demanded, his hand moving back toward his weapon. "I've been investigating," Gideon corrected. "My mining operations bring significant money into this territory. I make it my business to know how that money affects the communities where I operate. What I found in Copper Ridge was disturbing." He turned to look directly at Clementine. "I saw a 14-year-old girl doing the work of a grown woman while her guardian spent every penny on whiskey and cards. I saw bruises on her arms when she went to the well each morning. I saw her mending clothes by candlelight long after decent folks were asleep." Clementine's cheeks burned with embarrassment and something else, a strange mixture of violation and relief. Someone had been watching her suffering, but someone had also cared enough to do something about it. So you had these papers drawn up before you ever spoke to her? Sheriff Kane pressed. I had them prepared as a contingency. I hoped I wouldn't need them. I hoped Rufus would come to his senses, or that some family member would intervene, or that the community would step in to help. Gideon's voice carried disappointment and anger. Instead, I watched him get more desperate and more dangerous. Tonight, when I saw him heading to the saloon with Clementine in tow, I knew what he was planning. The sheriff processed this information, glancing between the document and Gideon's face. Even if everything you're saying is true, purchasing a human being is still illegal. You could have come to me, worked through proper channels. And how long would that have taken, Sheriff? How many nights would Clementine have spent in that cabin while bureaucrats shuffled papers? How many more bruises would she have collected while we waited for the territorial government to act? Before Kane could respond, rapid footsteps echoed up the stairs. Rufus Callahan appeared on the landing, wild-eyed and clutching a shotgun. Nobody's taking my property anywhere. The narrow hotel hallway erupted into chaos as Rufus stumbled up the stairs, his shotgun weaving dangerously in his unsteady hands. The $20 Gideon had paid him was already half spent on more whiskey, and liquid courage had convinced him that he'd been cheated out of his rightful property. Put the weapon down, Rufus, Sheriff Kane commanded, drawing his own gun in one fluid motion. You're drunk and you're not thinking straight. I'm thinking plenty straight, Rufus slurred, swaying on his feet. That girl belongs to me. Her daddy was my brother, God rest his soul, and that makes her my responsibility. I got legal rights. Clementine pressed herself against the wall, terror flooding through her as she stared down the barrel of the shotgun. She'd seen Rufus violent before, but never armed. The combination of alcohol and desperation had turned him into something truly dangerous. Rufus, Gideon said calmly, stepping slightly in front of Clementine. You already sold those rights. You took payment. The deal is done. I changed my mind, Rufus shouted. A man's got a right to change his mind about his own kin. Hotel guests were slamming doors and barricading themselves in their rooms. Jenny had disappeared entirely, probably fleeing through the back entrance. Harold stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, too terrified to move. Sheriff Kane tried to position himself for a clear shot, but the narrow staircase made it impossible without risking hitting Gideon or Clementine. Rufus, think about what you're doing. You point that gun at anyone and you'll hang for it. Don't care, Rufus mumbled, his finger hovering over the trigger. Lost everything else already. Might as well lose it all. It was then that Clementine realized something that chilled her to the bone. Rufus wasn't just here for the money anymore. She could see it in his bloodshot eyes, hear it in his rambling words. He was here because Gideon's intervention had shown the entire town what kind of man Rufus really was. He was here because his shame had fermented into rage, and she was the only target he could reach. Rufus, she said quietly, surprising everyone. I'll come with you. Clementine, no, Gideon said sharply. If I go with him, nobody gets hurt, she continued, her voice steady despite her terror. If I stay, someone dies tonight. Maybe all of us. For a moment, her words seemed to penetrate Rufus's drunken fury. The shotgun barrel lowered slightly as he considered her offer. But Gideon had seen enough. Sheriff, there's something else you need to know about those guardianship papers. Kane kept his weapon trained on Rufus. What? They're not just for Clementine. I'm establishing a legal fund to care for any child in this territory who finds themselves in similar circumstances. Backed by $200,000 of my personal fortune. The number was so staggering that even Rufus stopped swaying. $200,000 was more money than the entire town of Copper Ridge would see in a decade. Moreover, Gideon continued, any adult who harms a child under my protection will face more than territorial justice. They'll face the kind of trouble that money can buy. Private investigators, hired security, legal battles that last for years. He looked directly at Rufus. Ask yourself, Callahan, is your pride worth spending the rest of your life looking over your shoulder? The standoff stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Finally, Rufus lowered the shotgun completely. The fight went out of him as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only a broken old man who'd lost everything he'd ever cared about to drink and cards. Keep her then, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. Just take care of her better than I did. 3 months later, the Copper Ridge Children's Home opened its doors in a beautiful new building on the outskirts of town. Clementine Ross served as its first resident, and eventually, as Gideon Marsh's unofficial assistant in running the operation. Rufus Callahan left town the next morning and was never seen again, though rumors persisted that a man matching his description had joined a wagon train heading to California. Sheriff Kane kept Gideon's identity secret for as long as possible, but word eventually spread throughout the territory about the mining magnate who'd disguised himself as a drifter to save a child from slavery. The story inspired similar charitable efforts in other towns, and within 5 years, a network of children's homes stretched across the American Southwest. As for Clementine, she grew up to become a teacher and advocate for orphaned children, dedicating her life to ensuring that no child would ever again face the choice between family loyalty and personal survival. She never forgot the night a stranger in dusty clothes proved that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are hiding in plain sight. If you loved this story of courage and redemption, hit that subscribe button, because we have more incredible tales from the Old West that will restore your faith in human nature. Now click on the video on the screen, because the next story carries something you can't explain, only feel, and when it ends, you won't be the same. Click on the video now.